Good morning, everyone. So glad you're here with us today. My name is Jake. I pastor here alongside my wife, Chantal. She sends her greetings to you today. She's in Tri-Cities at a church called Hope Tri-Cities, which Angel and Laura Esquivel planted out of this church almost a decade ago, and they are there. And so we have some missionary friends that we support as a local church, but also are supporting there, and they're at that church. So she's there with them, spending some time with them. So she told me to tell you guys hello. Before we get into our message today in this series on King David, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Some of you know that this last week we have been given some new recommendations from our state that encourage mask wearing in public settings. And so I know that I just want to remind us of who we are as a church, okay? First thing is that we know that COVID is real. I've had COVID. I have friends who have had COVID. I've lost a friend to COVID. I recognize that. It's real. We also have taken a stance here that we're going to support each other, that we are going to carry a culture of honor, we're going to carry a culture of respect for one another, and we're going to let this be a no-shame culture. And so if you're here at Yakima Foursquare, just know that if you want to wear a mask, you can wear a mask. If you don't want to wear a mask, that's okay as well. We're not going to judge you. This is part of who we are, okay? We're in this thing together. Here's the reality. There is still a risk to going anywhere in a public setting like this. There's a risk, and so we recognize that. And so if this isn't a place that you feel comfortable, watch online with us. Never miss church. Over the course of this last, 15, 16 months, however long it is since we initially shut down, we've never missed a Sunday, and you don't have to either. You can stay engaged. You can look for ways to continue to serve, even if you are at home with us. So I want to say hi to everyone who is at home. Glad you were here with us. But that's just a little bit of our housekeeping, okay? So wanted you guys to know that's where we're at. If anything else comes from this, we'll continue to keep you updated, okay? But that is where we currently are. We are in this series through the life of King David. I am so excited about it. I love King David's life, and that's just because I feel like I can relate to a lot of it, as I imagine many of you probably can as well. But last week, Austin, he started off our series through the life of David, where he talked about the moment that David was anointed to be king. And it was this incredible moment because this insignificant little shepherd boy was anointed to be the king of Israel. It was totally unexpected. And then Austin also talked, though, about how for David, it wasn't like he became anointed and then became king right away, but that there was a period of waiting, a period that he had to honor King Saul. He had to respect King Saul, and it was about 15 to 16 years later that he finally actually became king. So there's a lot to learn from that. But today we're going to continue in David's story, but I want to give you a little heart behind why we're even doing this series through King David's life in the first place. You know, our word for this year is framework. We recognize that some walls fell down in our lives last year, and we felt like this was a year that we were going to rebuild and that we're going to go back to the basics. And we're going to focus in on what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we're going to build on that foundation that is Jesus Christ, and we're going to have this framework. And so when we have a series through these 6 key moments in David's life, the purpose of doing that is recognizing how relatable David is, that we can all relate to him in one way or another. He was a man who lived a called life. He was a man who had a hard life as well, right? Like he was moments full of joy, but then also just moments of like great suffering and pain. He had incredible faith in God, but he also struggled with addiction and sin. And David is just one of these guys that we can relate to. You know, he had moments of incredible confidence, and then these moments where he just found himself deep in fear. And so he cried a lot. I don't know if any of you guys cry a lot. David cried a lot. He cried out to God a lot. He even got mad at God sometimes. So I think we all can relate to him. The reality is that the life of David is the life of us, except for like the king part. I'm not sure. I mean, if you are in royalty of some way, like that's awesome. I'd love to chat with you afterwards. But outside of that, I think we really can relate to King David. We can learn great lessons from his life as we learn to follow Jesus and learn how to walk through similar things that David walked through. Today we're going to pick up the story just after David was anointed to be king. David, he has now met King Saul already in the last chapter. In chapter 16, we read about this. David was hired by Saul's officials to come and play the harp for him. Okay, and so Saul was dealing with this spiritual mental breakdown thing that was causing him to have like great fits of depression, to have this paranoia that he couldn't get a hold of, and so they had David come in and play the harp for him to soothe Saul as he was going through these times. And so even though David was there, there's no indication that Saul really had any interaction with him other than the fact of like, hey, there's this young man who plays the harp for me, and it makes me feel better. So that's what we see. But in this next chapter that we get to, we'll recognize that Saul does get to know who David really is. So some of you might be pretty familiar with this story that we're going to read about today. It is literally probably the most well-known story in our entire Bibles. Like, there are people who have never heard of Jesus, but have heard of David and Goliath, right? Like, this is like, it's the ultimate like underdog story, right? Like the sports movies that are all about like the David and Goliath. Like, oh, here's a real David and Goliath fight right here, right? Like every boxing movie, like Rocky was like the David and Goliath to everyone. It's like, oh, every time he had to come against somebody, he's fighting this giant Russian. If you've grown up in the church, you've probably heard this story before many times. And I'm just going to say, don't check out. Don't head for the doors. Like get in, because I'm not going to focus on some of the analogies, right? I'm actually we want to look really at the story. What happened? How did David act? And what can we learn from his life? I'm not going to talk about how your struggles are the Goliath in your life that you will overcome. It's a great message. It's true. You can overcome the struggles. It's just like that. It's a great message. I've heard it before. Wonderful. I'm also not going to baby this story down like we do for our kids. Like, the reality of the David and Goliath story is that it is a violent story. That Goliath is like cussing out the Israelite army while they're on the battlefield. Like, this is the reality of the story. And so we're going to look at the story, and we're going to look at the fact that David had something special. And it really started with the fact that he believed in God, like many of us do. So to set the story, David, he was back with his sheep in Bethlehem. He had spent some time with the armies and with Saul, right, playing his harp. But he also went home to take care of the sheep. And so there was a moment where Jesse, his dad, asked him, hey, will you take some food to the front lines? Will you take some food to your brothers and to their commanders? Which is something that actually was culturally normal, that the families of those who were off at battle would bring supplies to the armies for them. And so Jesse was asking him to do that, to go and to bring back a report. Say, hey, figure out how your brothers are doing. Bring back a report. Tell me how everything's going. What they didn't know, though, is that the Philistine army decided that they weren't going to have this like full-on attack, this full-on war with the Israelites. Part of the reality also is that the Israelite army was bigger than the Philistine army. And so another thing that was common in the day was for people to say, instead of going to battle and having a lot of men lose their lives, let's just choose a champion from each side to go to battle. And so the Israelites were pretty confident going into the battle. And then when the Philistines said, hey, let's do this duel instead, they're like, yeah, that's fine, because you've got nobody that can beat our best, right? And then Goliath came out, right? Little did they know that the Philistines literally recruited a giant to be their champion. In the Hebrew, it says that he was 6 cubits and a span tall, which would equal out to being about 9 foot, 9 inches, give or take a couple inches. So this was a big dude. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are these ancient texts that have been found recently, it actually says that he was 4 cubits and a span. Also in the Greek, it says that, which would mean that he was about 6'9", give or take a couple inches. But either way, this was a big dude. I don't know. I'm an NBA fan. Any NBA fans out there? I know I kind of stand alone in Washington. For some reason, Sonics left and everybody's like, NBA. I still like the NBA, okay? And part of the reality that I recognize as I watch basketball is that the taller the player is, like the less agile and athletic they actually are. They're good at like blocking shots and getting rebounds because they don't even have to jump to get them. Like, that's just part of the reality. So when I'm thinking about this aspect of a 9'9" compared to 6'9", I kind of lean more towards the fact, I'm like, I feel like he probably would be more like 6'9", because I'm thinking of like, the tallest players who ever played in NBA is like 7'6", and they didn't move very well, right? So this person's supposedly 2 feet taller than that person. I don't know how agile. I feel like I could take him. Probably not, but still, I could think that at least. So I'm thinking that maybe that 6'9" LeBron James is more like what Goliath is, right? I'm like, okay, I'm going to lean in on that one a little bit. But either way, I wasn't there. I don't know how tall he actually was. It wasn't like the Israelites were going up to him in battle and being like, wow, yeah, you are 9'9". That's crazy. So we don't really know for sure. But either way, he was a big, scary dude. And this is what it says in 1 Samuel 17, starting verse 5. It says that he wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of the spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds, and his armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. I mean, could you just imagine this guy, right? Like coming out just like, boom, boom, right? And then it says that like he squares his broad shoulders up to the Israelite army and he yells out, why do you come out and line up for battle? says, am I not a Philistine and you are not the servants of Saul? He says, choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Then it says, this day I defy the armies of the Lord, the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other, right? So he's just like, come at me. And then you have like the Israelites who are like peeking over the hill, like, I don't really know. It says, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Otherwise, that could be translated as, oh crap, right? They're like, they didn't know what to do. Like, how can we can't, right? And you, no, I don't, like, they were like, we can't take this guy. Any confidence that they had has left the building. Like, they're starting to picture in their mind, like, oh my gosh, like we're going to be slaves to the Philistines. Like, what's going to happen to our families? What's going to happen to our homes? They're struggling through this. Like, I don't know what to do. Who's going to go against this guy? No one was willing to step forward and fight, not even King Saul, who when Saul became king, it says that he was a head and shoulders above everybody else. So he was a big guy as well. And still, he was like, nope, not me. When are you guys going to do that? So no one wanted to get up and fight Goliath. They were all struck with fear. And then it says that for 40 straight days, Goliath would come out in front of the Philistine army. He'd line up every day, and every day he would say the same phrase like we just read. The same thing over and over again. And every day, no Israelite would come forward and fight him. The Philistines knew that they couldn't take the whole Israelite army, but the Israelite army knew that they couldn't take the champion. And then the shepherd boy showed up, bringing food for his brothers. Hey guys, what's going on, right? Like, the shepherd boy shows up. It says, early in the morning, David left the flock in care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry, which is funny to me because it means like every morning the Israelites woke up and they're like, today's the day we're going to do it. And they'd walk out there and then Goliath would do his thing. They're like, maybe tomorrow, right? And they would go back to their thing because at least they shout with a war cry every day. It says Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers, hey, how are you? Like, how are things going? And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. So David goes out, right? And he's like, hey guys, what's going on? Like, are things going okay? And then Goliath does this thing, and David's watching him like, who's this guy? He's like, what are you guys? And he looks back, and they're all gone. He's like, wait, where'd you guys all go? What's happening here? David's all like curious. He wants to be part of the fighting. He's like, let's do this thing. He drops all of his things. He goes out to the army. He sees them all cower in fear at the words of Goliath. And David's like, what? Like, why is no one going out to kill this guy? What are you guys doing? It's been 40 days? Really? And like, I don't know. He's scary. You do it. I don't know. Right? They're scared. No one wants to go out there. And they said, hey, yeah, even the king says he'll lavish people with riches. Whoever goes out there, he'll lavish them with riches. And David's like, what? Like, this is easy. And you can also get riches? David says, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? He says, who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? It's like, who is this guy? Like, excuse me? Does he know who he is defying? I'm going to go talk to the king. David's like, I'm going to do this thing. I'll go talk to the king. Like, I got this guy. David reminds me of that, like the junior hire who's shorter than everybody, but walks like he's 6 feet tall and is like, I got this, right? Like, that's what David reminds me of. He's like, I'll go talk to the king. I'm going to go tell Saul. I'll take care of this thing. So he goes in there. He goes to Saul, and Saul's probably sitting in his tent, like pulling his hair out because it's been 40 days, and he's like, what are we going to do? Like, someone's got to go fight him, or I don't know. And then someone comes in and says, hey, someone said they're willing to go fight the giant. And so I was like, what? Wait, really? Someone's coming? And he's like, who is it? Send him in, right? It's like, and then David walks in. He's like, where is he, right? Because David's tall and Saul's tall, David's short. He's like, oh, who are you? And David walks in all confident. He's like, don't worry about this Philistine. I'll go fight him. And Saul literally laughs at him. He's like, what are you talking about? Like, Saul says, don't be ridiculous. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. And he's been a man of war since his youth. And David was like, excuse me? He's like, do you know who I am? I am David, the son of Jesse. I'm a shepherd. I play the harp. And Saul's like, and that's supposed to make me feel better. Like, David's walking in there, and it says David looks at Saul, and he's like, hey, you know, when a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. And if that animal turns on me, I grab it from the jaw and I club it to death. Whoa, like, okay, David, like, this is nuts. David's like, God, I've killed a lion. I've killed a bear. Who's this LeBron James looking pagan who's speaking out against the Lord of God's armies, right? He's like, I can take him. Sheesh. Who is this guy? He's like, you know who we represent, right? You know who has our back, right? The all-powerful God of creation, the maker of heavens and earth. This guy has nothing. God saved me from a lion and a bear. He can save me from a Philistine too. And Saul's like, oh gosh. All right, you know what? It's been 40 days. No one's said they'll fight him yet. It's better that a teenager dies than I die. Right? So like, all right, we'll do this thing. You can go fight the giant. All right. And so the story goes, right? David comes in. Saul puts all of his armor on him. David's like hanging in it. It's like, no, this isn't going to work. It's all too heavy for him. He's like, I've got this. It's fine. I got it. I will make this thing happen. Right, and so David, he grabs his sling and he grabs his 5 small rocks from the stream nearby, and he goes out to the battlefield. He walks out toward Goliath, and I love this part of the story. It says, Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy, which some translations would say that ruddy-faced means redheaded, and I'm just going to stick with that. David was redheaded, just like me, right? And so the Goliath, he goes out and he's like, am I a dog that you come at me with a stick? And he starts cursing David by all the names of his God. He says, come over here. I'm gonna give your flesh to the birds and the animals. And David replies to this Philistine, yeah, you come at me with a sword. You come at me with a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies. He's like, you think you got something special going on there, Goliath? You don't. The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, the Lord will conquer you, and I will cut you. No, I'll cut you? No, I will kill you and cut your head off. And I'll give all the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with the sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. Like, woo, yeah, David, let's do it. Right? He's coming out like with his same words. Like, oh yeah, you think you're going to feed me to the birds and the wild animals? No, I'm going to feed you to the birds and the wild animals. So Goliath steps forward for the attack. He's like, all right, let's do this thing. And David, he like springs to action, right? He pulls a stone from his shepherd's bag. He swings it around. He launches at him and right in the head. And it's like those cartoon movies where Goliath's like, right? And then he falls to his knees and falls on his face. And then the children's stories ends right here. Yay, David won. David beat Goliath. But what did David promise Goliath? Right? It says, today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give you the dead bodies of your men to the birds and the wild animals. The whole world will know there's a God in Israel. So David, he runs over and he grabs Goliath's sword and he fulfills his promise. We can keep it a little bit PG-13. The Israelites conquer the Philistines that day. One of the greatest stories in our Bibles. I love this story. But why was David so confident? Why did David have just all this just confidence just oozing out of him as this little shepherd boy going up against a Goliath of a man, a giant? Because honestly, we talk about, hey, this series is going to be great because we all relate to David in some way, one way or another. This is not one of those areas that probably most of us relate to David. We probably more relate to the Israelite armies in this story where we're stuck in fear. We're afraid of what's in front of us. We don't want to go to battle against the hard things in life. We get scared, we get depressed, we get anxious, we get doubtful. But David knew something that we all should know as well. See, David had all that confidence because of his faith in God. He knew God as dependable. He knew that throughout all the crises that we will face in our life, God shows up and he is faithful. David knew that God would be there, that the Lord would not desert him while he was facing this giant. See, the Spirit of God lived in David's body. It was God who would guide his sling. It was God who would give him the victory. And David knew that. He wrote about it in the Psalms. In Psalm 18, David says, God arms me with strength and he makes my way perfect. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, enabling me to stand on mountain heights. He trains my hands for battle. He strengthens my arm to draw a bronze bow. He's like, God's got me. God's got me. He makes my way perfect. See, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Israelites who were out on that hill that day. But no one saw the battle the way that David saw the battle. Maybe you've heard it said before that there are people who make things happen, people who watch things happen, and people who don't know that anything is actually happening. David knew what was in front of him. He knew what he was going up against. And it wasn't a physical conflict between two armies, but it was a spiritual one. It was a battle between truth and error. It was a battle between faith and superstition. It was a battle between the true and living God and dead idols. Paul says in Ephesians 6, for we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. That's our battle. And guess what? We have a conqueror among us. And even more than that, we have a conqueror who's within us. God has always fought on behalf of his people. In the law of Moses, the priest would come before the Israelite army before they would go to battle, and he'd say, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. And David knew this. He knew that God was on his side, that the same God that was there for the Israelite armies, the same God who is for David is also for us. Is also for us. And he proved that by sending his only son to die on the cross for us. He's like, I'm going to get behind you. I'm going to go to battle for you. Literally, we were facing a battle against sin and death that we could not conquer on our own. And so Jesus came and conquered it for us. He took on that battle for us. And then in the greatest picture of love and protection, God literally put his Spirit within us. He sent his Spirit to dwell among us, a helper, someone who would fight our battles for us. I'm a recovering addict. My prayer almost every day is, Holy Spirit, fight my battles for me, because I can't do it on my own. Right? The Spirit is with us. He actually intercedes on our behalf. That is who we have with us. That is his promise, which is why Paul says in response to this good news, he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? If our God is for us, who can be against us? If our God is for us, who can be against us? We can walk in confidence like David walked in confidence. We can carry that same confidence that David carried because we have a God, big God, on our side. And it's just like John said in 1 John. He says, we've already won the victory. We already have the victory because the Spirit who lives in us is greater than the Spirit who lives in the world. The Spirit who lives in you is greater than the Spirit is in the world. We can walk in that same confidence. Let's pray together.